this is something that is definitely crucial, that we're, monitoring and watching our communities. And as Quinn said, we do want to reach out to municipalities and say, hey, because I can't tell you how many times I've talked to different government officials and they're like, well, you're going to add 300 homes. So, how much water is that? I don't know if we have capacity for that. And they'll say, all right, don't worry. We're looking to control this and, be efficient with our water usage.
And I think, what's really important, and we'll get to it here in a minute, is like we hear about what that return to NOI is, but I think what's really important is to hear about how that spans across a portfolio. And what really opened my eyes up was talking to Celia about this a little bit, and with KeyBank, and how they're looking at this as a portfolio adjustment. So
Yeah, so I am I'm a lawyer by training, so like I got to keep math simple for myself because the math is not my best thing. But it's actually simple math equation, right? So we all know revenues here, expenses are here. Different those two things, that's your NOI, right? And we are in a time where the revenue number doesn't have nearly as much growth as we've seen in past years, right? So we're starting to see stagnation and revenue growth across the country. Some areas more so, than others. If a lot of your rental revenue is coming from subsidized programs, a lot of us saw the very doomsday Washington Street Journal article that came out today that says there's concerns about where that's going to even be more compressed because of budget tightening from those funding programs coming out of HUD. And so that means that where do you fix those things, right? Then you go to your expenses, right? So if your revenue growth is not going to be tremendous, then the only way to kind of stabilize and keep the NOI growing is looking at your expenses. You look at your expenses, we all know that the one conversation a lot of folks are having is like, where are the two, or actually there's three main places where that revenues is killing you. It's killing you on the insurance, it's killing you on real estate taxes and utilities, right? So you take those three things, the conversation about insurance will continue to be a conversation. The conversation about real estate taxes, there are opportunities to find a way to kind of control that growth or minimize that cost. And then your utilities, especially as a large owner or owner of properties, you think about where those two areas, you got electric and you got water. For most affordable housing developers, the one area that the I call it the owner bears, you'll find is the water, right? A lot of people are not running around separately metering every single one of their units for water. So that's not like that cost is being transplanted or translated to directly to your tenants. So that's a cost that really becomes a part of your expense account and your expenses. And if there's some way that you can control that, some way that you can improve that, then it's the math is math in here. And this is a way, if you can figure out that, and there's definitely solutions to do that, and it's kind of a no-brainer. But then the question is what brass tacks, what does that mean? I don't know how many of you have been working on projects and gotten to what I call the sticky wicket of conversion, right? And you're trying to figure out how you're trying to make sure that your project's hitting that, that DCR is hitting, that occupancy is hitting all those milestones so you can convert to your permanent financing. And on top of that, how are you sizing that permanent financing? Is that loan proceeds going to be enough to cover your entire conversion and pay off all your construction and other debt that you put on the project during construction? It becomes that back and forth on really recognizing what that NOI is has become probably one of the most stressful conversations I think that we as lenders and you as developers end up having, because you got to make sure that the project's going to hit that. If it's simple, if there's a way, think about it, we have enough data that can support that, we can underwrite to a lower utility cost because there's enough data to support that there are a programmatic and efficient way to address that particular cost in your expenses, then I think it's a game changer. it's an absolute game changer, and something that I think that overall we think about ways to kind of like, I always say that the most important things, how do we constrict those expenses so we can really be able to have like strong NOIs, really be able to really address, NOI in terms of like looking at basically your loan proceeds, because at the end of the day, this is it becomes a debt game. Then that is where you focus on, and the areas that you can control that, and the areas where you can prove to your lender that this is the right number to underwrite and not this other higher number that you're used to underwriting. Because you'll find, a lot of developers, we're working with you all, and you're looking at your appraisals and your other
Oh, yeah.
kind of project comparabilities, and they're like, oh, you're underwriting to X in terms of your utilities and your expenses, but the rest of all these other appraisals and all these other uh, similar properties have this much higher number. How do you support, us believing in that lower number? It's right here.
Yeah.
It's right here. We got the
Zion.
data. We got the data to prove it, right? So that's simple, right?
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, that was the thing that got me really intrigued too.
Mhm.
Is it's not like trying to figure out Pythagoras theory. I mean, it's
Yes,
it's
yes.
like literally
Yeah.
you simply touch those to be like, this is what this is.
Yeah.
And with that being said, Orlando, Lily spoke a little bit about this impact of 15.5 across their portfolio. Um, let's break it down into like the average to a property. Like I saw some figures where if you consider what your cost per gallon is of water and then what that usage reduction is, what are you seeing as like an average savings on an individual project level?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, Dominium's portfolio specifically, right? Their average property size is 200 units, 400 bedrooms, right? So, Dominium is essentially able to plan for, right, based on their water performance compared to industry comps, an additional $750 a year, right, per unit in additional operating income. So if you think about that, like what can that $750 be used for, right? And one, to hedge against other additional increasing, costs that Celia mentioned, but also, to support resident services, right, and resident amenities and initiatives like that. So being able to have that knowledge, right? That not only are you going to be able to achieve this level of efficiency, but you're going to be able to maintain it, right? So the only offsetting factor, right, is going to be increases to water rates, right? And that is something that people need to be cognizant of, right? Because utility rates are increasing, right? I presented it a Novogradac panel right after they published their annual report earlier this year. And utility costs, right, year over year in their survey had increased by 8%, right? But it wasn't broken out between water and electric and gas, right? It was just an overall 8% increase. I would bet my house that water alone was responsible for 75 to 80% of that increase, right? And a lot of developers and even investors aren't making that differentiation yet today, right? And the reason water costs today nationally are increasing 2.5 times faster than inflation, right? So far faster than any other utility expenses, right? And there's a number of reasons for that. Water scarcity is now impacting every single state at least a localized level, right? Sometimes more broadly. Texas, right? We're in Texas, so let's talk about Texas. Texas is at the top, right? Or top three, right? Facing water scarcity nationally. Okay. So that essentially means there isn't enough supply for the demand for water in a lot of markets, and planned continued growth, right? So it's a simple, supply demand economics, right? And a lot of additionally, there's a lot of water infrastructure needs across the country, right? So across the U.S. over the next 20 years, EPA estimates additional north of $740 billion is needed in water infrastructure investment. In Texas, the Texas Water what is it? Texas Water Development Board, sorry, estimates that today, 20 billion is needed in Texas just for wastewater systems alone, and 60 billion is needed over the next 20 years, right? So this is going to start impacting a lot of markets. Kyle, Texas, from 2012 to 2022, 6.8% increase to water rates. That's the amount that you're paying per gallon of water over 10 years. New Braunfels, 10% increase in 2025, and another one planned for 2026. Houston just had a 14% increase to their water rates in 1 year. And Hideaway, Lindales, this is a rural market, from 2024 to 2025 had a 300% increase, right? And these rural communities, right, don't have as many consumers, right, customers to spread those infrastructure costs across, right? So this is something that people need to think about more, but being able to go ahead, Celia, I'm sorry.
No, you're right. That the data is important, but I just want to, we're connecting the two things because we saw this happen in the real world, right? I don't know, and a lot of times we're having, like, let's be honest, we're in a state where we're a state, as in not this particular state thing, like the state of being. We're in a state of
You're
being.
in Texas, so everything is the state.
Yeah, okay. we're at this point, and we're at this inflection point where, like, we know that a lot of our municipalities, and local government are budgetary strained, right? There's no question. And there's only but so many places that they can recoup, that they can basically gather, costs, right? They can actually figure out ways to fund their infrastructure, fund their staffing, fund their programs. And water and utility costs has been one of those places that for a while has been where those local municipalities and counties and even the state has looked at. I know those of us who have been around long enough but don't want to admit how old they are, remember that when the state of Michigan was under what's it called when you broke and then somebody comes in? It's like a receivership or something.
Yeah.
When they were under receivership, they basically were trying to figure out a way to address their fiscal issues. And one of the things they did, they completely, for lack of better word, jacked up the water usage costs. And we had a series of projects that we were looking at, affordable projects that were in the red. I always get that black or red, whatever. They were in the bad, like overnight. Overnight. And it wasn't an occupancy issue. It wasn't it wasn't lack of rental revenue. It was that overnight they had the highest utility costs than they ever projected for. So trying to solve for that, and like we're seeing that is where, when you think about it, that when the municipalities are facing fiscal issues, jacking up that water cost is one of the first places that they look.
Yeah. And we, specifically in Texas, especially over the last several years, and, if anybody attended the policy and legislative panel where you saw the discussion going on there about HB 21 and its impact to HFCs. And we've seen a pretty dramatic push to make adjustments to real estate taxes. And that goes from affordable housing deals all the way up to market rate developments. And, obviously there's been some challenges with implementing that at different levels. You get traveling HFCs, and not to make this panel anything about that, but that is largely driven by the inherent need to make your operating costs as efficient as possible, because you're facing a higher interest rate environment.
Right.
Your payroll is your payroll. You're gonna have a tough time kind of managing that. Insurance is, as many of you guys know, is we need to do something about insurance, particularly on these properties, and kind of how we're handling that in the state of Texas in particular, but across the country. So there's a scramble there. And when you see that you could come out with these outputs and do some stuff about water usage, to me, it crosses multiple spectrums. Like, it's a good public use. It's a good thing to be able to go and say, hey, we're custodians of the water. But I think one of the things I definitely want to emphasize in what Celia is saying is the lenders are looking at this. Like, the lenders and the capital partners are looking at this and they're interested in underwriting to it. We heard in that legislative panel, there was a discussion about how, well, the market will make its own adjustments and lenders will adjust to this issue. I'll put my lending hat on. I was a banker for a while.
Mhm.
I'll tell you right now, typically what you do, you have to go to your credit committee and you're going to just have to say, hey, I underwrote this Texas deal and I used a comp real estate tax number. And this is my number that I'm using, even if it's a full abatement or a 50%
Right.
abatement, because I can't guarantee that that abatement is going to stay in place now. There's no roadmap that that's a definitive thing. So as a lender, I got to make sure that that my exposure is covered at the end of the day.
Right.
This is something that's different to that,
Yeah.
right? So this is an underwritable thing that you could take a look at.
that has backed up data that supports it. So like most important thing is like there's actual data that says like this is a reality, this is how it's played out. And then you think about this over time, looking at that cost in your budget, like it's a no-brainer if you can figure out a way to support saying that, hey, I'm going to have a much lower cost on what you're seeing in your current portfolios or what you're seeing in these your comparables that you've probably pulled for underwriting or analyzing this project.
I've known some people in the ground, Val and Delion here, and some other folks here. I have told the story before. When I first got introduced to Texas, it was like '96. Related hired me to come out and do due diligence on some applications that were coming in, and I spent a lot of time in San Marcos, and their water number was just like through the roof. Like I couldn't figure out where they were getting their water number from. I mean, I went to the health department. I pulled bills from other operating properties, and they were factoring in the number of lower income tenants living on the property would have less disposable income and therefore would use a lot more water in the units. They even had factors for, and I'm not kidding with you, it's like they had factors for the level of alcoholism in the market. And so they applied that to water usage and how much water usage would be on a given property. So it was a very interesting learning lesson for me about how in depth that folks will look at water and sewer usage and determine its impact to operating expenses.
I'm still a little confused about the alcoholism in the water. Like,
yeah.
At some point, maybe over a drink, we can talk about that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why is the drink. So, but no, it was a very interesting metric, especially having spent my whole life pretty much doing the underwriting. Like that was a new thing for me to kind of hear that component of it. But obviously, one of the things I did appreciate walking away from that, as ludicrous as it kind of sounded, was how like deep down that folks dig into kind of that water and sewage and see what that impact is. So how are you seeing that on the developer level with your pulling the data and so on and so forth, working with the capital team that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we see so many different rates for utilities. You couldn't believe it. Like everything, from what we're doing, lowered rates from ION, but we have all these comps, so our banks are going to hire appraisers, right, to do it. We have little to no control. I'm always shaking in my boots when I get an appraisal through my email because I'm like, here we go.
Yeah.
How can I hack down the expenses? And the first thing I turn to is utilities because that's something, as we're talking about on this panel, is controllable, right? Whereas, as the folks up here have mentioned, we are not really able to control real estate taxes. We know we can fight tooth and nail against the county appraisal districts, but you never know where we're going to get. Payroll keeps going up. Insurance is out of the roof these days. So I agree. It's something, that's always crazy. And so we really have to, build a strong relationship with lenders and, really explain to them, like the proof is in the statistics, the numbers we're seeing. You can pull most of our Dominium portfolio properties and it just shows, hey, we've saved a lot of money. For example, we have a property that's in Florida. It's called the Crossings at Cape Coral. So when we initially acquired the property, we were using 110 gallons per bedroom per day. And since acquiring the property and implementing the ION system, we now only use 40 gallons per bedroom per day. So that really shows and really brings down that water cost, which is something a lender is going to, take a look and say, okay, look, this actually has happened.
On that note, really quick, what if you were to just take a stab, Orlando? What would be? I want to correlate the two between what your price of usage per gallon, in going from 110 to 40.
Yeah, we actually did a case study with Dominium on that acquisition specifically. So Dominium is realizing $16,000, right, per month in additional operating income compared to prior, right? So post acquisition, just via water performance, that was a $3 million value additive, right, post acquisition. And we're a water optimization company, right? But we're not a widget company, right? We're not just selling devices and saying good luck with this. We are, fully immersed with our clients, with our partners, across, their development teams, their acquisition teams, their site and asset management teams, even their disposition teams, right? So we're constantly evaluating acquisition opportunities, with them, alongside them, to uncover, is there upside in some of these at some of these properties. And you know a lot of developers that we're not working with, right, would maybe look at some of these deals and say that maybe they're not going to pencil, right? But being able to have the knowledge that, based on the tenancy of that property, right, where you're going to be able to uh, maintain water performance, and then engineering anticipated expenses around that, right, enables you to look at properties and determine there's $150,000, right? $200,000, $400,000. Like, sometimes the numbers are absolutely staggering, right? In upside and water performance, and being able to capitalize on that. And Lily mentioned that there are a lot of water rate variance, from state to state, market to market. There's over 40,000 community water systems across the U.S., right? In Texas alone, I think there's over 4,000 water utilities, right? They all bill differently, right? So not using comps, like the HUD model as an example, right? We'll take PHA, Public Housing Authority data for a specific geographic area. It can have a mix of different utility providers in that area that can have completely different rate structures, right? So it's valuable, right, to be able to have the knowledge of the performance, and also those rate structures, to see what the upside is. And as an example, McCormick, Bear, and Salazar, they have a property in San Francisco. It was hard to wrap my head around the fact that when we sat down with them and we said, we think we can save you over 100,000 gallons of water a day, right, at this one property. And sure enough, right, they one property, they're conserving 100,000 gallons of water a day, over $1 million, right, in increased operating income related to water expenses at one property in 1 year.
Yeah.
Right. That's the most extreme, so
Yeah.
I can't promise that, to replicate that everywhere.
Orlando.
Yeah. but they're paying 3.7 cents per gallon, for water and sewer there. So it really behooves developers, right, to and investors, right, to look at that data and information at a granular level.
That's kind of what I was leading, is like, you look at that number, 3.37 cents per gallon, and you got the savings here, and then all that kind of adds up pretty dramatically. So that simple math thing that you were talking about, Celia, is there. On the crossings deal, it was this kind of like the go, no go, like this was like, hey, this is really going to make this an opportunity for us be able to maximize its operating costs and return to the NOI.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wasn't specifically involved in this acquisition. However, we're always talking at Dominium, how can we improve our deals? How can we add value? Because, in changing market environments, we really need to figure out a true, like, concise, or not even concise, like a really valuable high value add to an acquisition property, because they're always varying in price and everything, so we want to make sure we're adding enough value and being able to get enough debt on the property when we're trying to acquire deals. So like earlier we mentioned, all right, take the water expense, drive it down, that's going to help us size our debt better. It's going to allow us to pay more for the property or win the deal, really, and keep it operating. So something, even on deals that we will acquire that we're not planning to re-syndicate right away, we always look at, okay, one, do they have ion? Two, what are their water expenses? And, we always see, okay, if there's not ion systems in the property, we're like, okay, let's just put the investment in right away so we can, have that better holdover in operations until comes time for either refinance, re-syndication, conversion, you name it.
So I was thinking about this, we're talking a lot about like early at the front end of deals, but really we think about this as also an incredibly good tool for the back end, right? So when you're thinking about refinancing, you're kind of exiting out of some other type of financing relationship, whether that is through a fund you're in, or it's just looking at your financing and thinking about, how do I kind of like, big, we're gonna get some cash
Yeah.
to do some other things. And I think about this, like, what tends to happen quite a bit when you're looking at a refinance, obviously they'll look at, like comparables, but they really look at like, well, what you actually did. Like, what was the actual cost at the projects? And you're thinking about like going forward, trying to make that case. Obviously, the data will help you support that. You're saying, hey, without this, with this refinancing opportunity, I'm going to figure out ways to kind of address his utility costs by, addressing a kind of a programmatic approach by partnering with, the type of people who help you do that. And you want to smile, Orlando, when I said that? And then thinking about that in terms of, we all know that a lot of our projects are, wrapped up in other type of financing relationships like funds and tax credit investors. And there's always some kind of disposition strategy on that back end that will maybe require you to kind of think about what that refinancing scenario looks like. Right. So you can either figure out, like, because not every project is going to get re-syndicated.
Right.
It just ain't enough credits, y'all.
We wish.
There's not enough credits, and there's not enough investors. Let's just be honest with it. So there are going to be some projects that it's not going to be a re-syndication opportunity, but there definitely will be a refinancing opportunity. Now, it sucks if you had like, a 30-year HUD 3.28. You don't want to refinance that. But there, some of the other things that are coming to that year 18, you're going to have to do something anyway.
Yeah.
This is one of the things to think about.
Yeah, that's a really good point that should resonate here, is that looking at the disposition back end and the hurdles that gazillion panels that we've had over the years about year 15 and so on and so forth. If you think about the strategies that are before you today, where we have a 25% test now, where you had a 50% test on your bond transactions. Now you need a 25% test to qualify your project as eligible to qualify for low-income housing tax credits is great. But where we'll see those instances where in disposition of existing tax credit deals, they'll, for a long time, you've been using these seller notes, to help offset some of the expense, the value of the property going forward. And the question is, how do you pay for that seller note at the end of the day? A lot of times cash flow notes and so on and so forth. One of the things that I'm certain we're going to see, I'm already looking at a couple of them in California, is that you're going to see the seller note become the tax-exempt bond issuance. And that tax-exempt bond issuance will be the qualifying factor to lever your low-income housing tax credits. And then as you get down the road to get to your savings, as Celia said earlier, you're going to do your conversion, you get a cram down of equity that comes in and hopefully takes that seller note out or pays it down to a certain level. So combining these things with those new opportunities out there is really going to help you leverage dispositions at the end of the day. It's good for those that want to acquire those older properties that are at risk. That's, here in Texas, there's an opportunity for you to look at these at risk, apply, that structure, bring in the water saving usage and create a revenue source to pay for that structure.
Absolutely. And a big thing at Dominium too is not only are we trying to build more housing, we're also trying to preserve affordable housing, so we, an iron can be implemented in a 20-year-old building or a brand new building. So we're trying to just really spread across our portfolio. Okay, let's keep this housing, this quality housing, because not every deal we own, we built. And so we have very specific standards at Dominium, but, we're always happy to acquire other properties, but we want to make sure it's something that we can hold long-term and keep with our company.
So we got about 30 minutes left. Orlando, what I'd like to do is to kind of get this away from the late night reverse mortgage talk. Like, what is that? How does this work kind of thing?
Yeah.
Can you give us kind of an outline? I know your system you have proprietary features and so on and so forth, but how do we interact with you as a development community, as a lending community to get you guys engaged? What are some of the steps that you guys take first off, that type of thing?
No, that absolutely happy to go through that. So a lot of times our relationships, right, when we talk about that life cycle value and impact that we have, it really, everyone's very busy in this industry, right? On the development side, on the property management side, and investors, right? There's not a lot of bandwidth, right? To dig into, right, new technologies or approaches to management, right? But we've got to start somewhere, right? So our relationships sometimes start, on with the development team or the acquisition teams or asset management teams, right? It can vary, but having the opportunity, right, to engage or help, right, one of those entities is really where we typically start. So on the development side, Harmony Housing as an example, right? We, formerly Greystone Affordable. We went through, a vetting process with them. We assessed a portion of their portfolio, right? And we saw, as typical, that there was a significant opportunity for improvement via water optimization by utilizing our platform. But it was actually a development opportunity, right? They had a newly constructed property in North Carolina that had a $1.6 million funding gap, and it was stuck. So we looked at the underwriting assumptions for water and sewer expenses at that property, right? They used a state agency endorsed utility analyst to go through that process. They used comp data, right, from the market and the HUD models to establish what those estimated expenses for water were going to be. We were able to provide them with an engineered, right, target consumption model, and use the local utilities rate structure to quantify what their fixed and variable expenses were going to be for that property, right? And then we were able to validate, right, that performance with our comp data from our platform, right? So, and that was an $86,000 a year delta for that specific property in planned operating income. And that was accepted by the state agency, as well as their debt and equity on the deal, and closed 1.2 million of that $1.6 million gap, right? So, and that's a high five moment, right? Like we like those, and that's the level of value, right? It might not be 1.2 million, right, in every single scenario. It's always going to vary based on the property, the location, the rate structure, but we have a team of analysts that are doing that on every single development deal, right? We brought on a new partner last year while I was at TAAHP, right? It was a champion from their asset management team that said, "Hey, there's something here, right?" And I'm going to pick up the torch and kind of go through this process. So we started looking for pilot opportunities, right? And the very first property that we went live with, literally the system turned on while I was at TAAHP. And I called Aaron and I said, "Hey, Aaron, we just got your data. You're losing 90% of your water right now as of yesterday." Right, it was the first day. So 90% of the water that they were paying for at this property as soon as they went live was being wasted. And within 3 days, they had stabilized the property and they were below 5% leak volume. Right. So
the wasted was really the leakage, not even like a usage issue.
yeah. So a lot of people think, that water costs are related to their resident behavior, right? Our residents just happen to use a lot of water, at this property, right? And that couldn't be the furthest from the truth,
Right.
So if 10% of your units are actively leaking, that's enough to double the consumption for the entire
Oh,
property.
good deal. Okay.
You know, so these are leaking toilets, these are leaking water heaters, mixing valves, right? So the term we use is invisible water loss, right? So this isn't water that's leaking and spilling out over your floors. This is water and money that's just going down your drains, right? So with that opportunity, that was our first opportunity with this developer, right? It was an existing operating property. It was their asset management team. Now we're looking at every single one of this developer's acquisition opportunities, right? For value add, opportunities as well. We're now working. There's other partners, right, that have become aware of this. So we have, we're as well as KeyBank. We have a common partner or a friend in the industry in Ohio Capital, right? And Tony De Blasi and his team, they've always been very supportive and interested in the impact that we're having for some of their developers. Recently, one of their asset managers said, "Hey, I need to make an introduction, to you guys. We have a permanent supportive housing developer who they're really struggling, on debt coverage, and the financials don't look good. We just went under contract with our first property for them. We're going to tap into an additional $1,500 per unit per year for them, right, to help stabilize financials. So we want to partner with our affordable developers, right, and all of their teams. We also want to, partner with the investors and lenders, right, that have a lot of these relationships and also have partners that are struggling, that have deals that are struggling. This is very personal for me, right? I grew up in affordable housing. I was raised by a single mother, and when you think about the fact that $6 billion a year, right, is addressable, and 100% addressable, right? Like that waste can be stopped, and that income can be repurposed, right, in affordable communities. So whether it's whether someone who's on the asset management side, in development, on the acquisitions teams, right, or even on the investor or lender side in asset management, and having access to deals that where water could potentially be a lifeline, right, to help offset a lot of the other financial pain that these communities are going through. We're here to help.
So we got a question, which kind of I think is framed a little bit. I mean, I think the case studies are obviously a good indicator, and I really appreciate kind of leaning in with some of those examples, and I think keeping that up would be good too, so folks can kind of get that that why and the monetary piece out of it, because I think that's so critical. The question is, how do we get tenants to reduce usage, and then secondly, how does water optimization work? We talked a little about that, and then the case studies. One of the things that we didn't quite go over here was, so how do you manage the tenant usage? We kind of framed it, but if I'm a tenant and I'm living in a property and my favorite movie is Costner's Waterworld, right? How do you work through
Which is an
the
awful
owner?
movie, by the way.
Yeah.
No, this is
Yeah. How do you work through the owner to get to that optimization at the tenant level? Because I do agree with you. You see it where the toilets are running, the valves are not working right. So
Yeah.
that obviously is like those things that you say you kind of don't realize is happening.
Yeah. So I mean, what's really interesting is that, and I have we haven't published this. Tabitha Parkinson is the director of utilities for Dominium. She was actually going to participate last year, but it was when on a panel here. But it was when the CrowdStrike fiasco happened, and nobody could fly into to Austin, so she wasn't able to make it. But um, there's a couple things. There's a couple myths or misconceptions I think about water. One is a lot of folks think we're putting in new efficient toilets, aerators, shower heads, right, fixtures, and that's enough to get us efficient, right? 100% of our newly constructed projects now, right, were the basis of design for Dominium and Kittle and Penrose and a number of other developers. 100% of the newly constructed properties that we install at with very efficient fixture packages that are installed, when our system goes live prior to occupancy, those properties are leaking. Not always catastrophically, right? But sometimes catastrophically, right? So putting in low flow fixtures and efficient plumbing fixtures is not the fix. Then second, resident behavior, right? Dominium just went through this exercise. Dominium doesn't bill residents at every property, right? But they do at some of the properties. We're able to impact financials in those scenarios because you can prove out that you're having lower utility expenses, right? And you can go back to the state agencies a lot of times and get UA adjustments, right, to uh, uh, estimated, water expenses. But Dominium was interested in understanding, hey, we're maintaining performance below 40 gallons per bedroom per day across our portfolio. They had approximately 30 properties where they weren't billing residents, right? So they decided to turn on billing at those properties. So even our team, right, at Ion thought, well, surely once the residents start paying for their water bills, they'll start using less water. And what we found out through this, analysis was that prior to billing and post billing, it was approximately a year prior and a year after, there was no change in consumption, right? So the properties were performing really well, but once the residents started, became responsible for paying for water, they didn't start using less water, right? They continued to take showers and wash clothes and do everything else in a traditional cadence, right? But what
Live the 4D experience watching Waterworld, right?
but there were other issues that impacted Dominium, and the fact that some of the residents, once they started getting that water bill, they just weren't paying for it,
Yeah.
right? So and I don't know where you guys are on that, but I believe it was the operations and utility team recommended, hey, if we're utilizing Ion, we shouldn't be billing residents, and
Yeah. No, and I can kind of jump in there. That's something I've noticed, and there's been a team at Dominium that involves, Tabitha Parkinson, and then some people in development. I'm not personally on this team, but I have been staffed on properties that I have seen this effect where we initially purchased the property and we weren't billing residents, and then we started to bill residents, and then as Orlando said, they're not paying. So now what just happened is we had to practically double our utility allowance, which therefore lowered the rents we could charge. And then we weren't recouping any of that, or barely any of that lost income we had. So it's just something it's like a lesson learned, at least something I've learned is like, okay, if you are planning to charge residents for utilities, do it from the very start and just kind of stick with it. It's like one of those things that you have to be decisive. So it's not just out the window. And, it's hard to collect and get residents to, um, just stay on their bills and everything. So,
Yeah. So how getting that genie back in the bottle is obviously difficult to kind of get them
Yeah.
to continue to pay once you're kind of there. And then getting them to understand, is there an education component, Orlando, that you guys do with the tenants?
Yeah, so we're really not we're not affecting resident behavior, right? We're implementing change management with our partners, right?
Gotcha.
The awareness of water conscious, we a lot of times we refer to it as being water conscious, right? At the site level, at the asset management level, at the executive level, so that there's awareness of how every single property is performing, right? So what's unique to our system is that every single day, down to every single unit, we're literally evaluating every water event in every unit of the property, right? And our system is determining, are these events, right, in these gallons associated with normal consumption, right? Or are they associated with abnormal consumption, right? Or potentially leaks? Then our system is diagnosing, right, what is causing that leak. And then we're automating work orders for that site team, right? So every single day, right, these site teams, site technicians, property managers, they know exactly how much water they consumed, how much was associated with waste, right, or leaks. But they have work orders that are telling them, you have a leak in unit 305 and it's a toilet, right? And it wasted 2,500 gallons of water in the last 24 hours, right? That's a quarter of a swimming pool, right? As a reference point. Other units have leaking water heaters, right? Or potentially something else, but it's very, very actionable data, right? So when we onboard with a new team, right, with the site team, we want them to be very successful and see the success of their actions, right, when we deploy at an operating property, right? So it's another one of those high five moments that we're looking for, right? There's a lot of stuff that's going on at these properties that is outside of that site team's hands, right? And I will say sometimes day one when they find out, hey, we're getting a new water management system and you guys are going to have work to do, right? Like like, are you kidding me? Right? Like something else that I have to do or manage. But that's not the case, right? The messaging is, look, you're not going to have an asset management team telling you had a massive spike in water consumption over the last 3 months. Go figure it out. It's somewhere at the property, right? This is the example that I just talked about, right? Where hey, Aaron, your system just went live. There's 6 units that are leaking that are causing this massive waste of water, and they're able to eliminate it, over a couple of days, right? By going into those specific units. So that's for people in this industry a lot of times, like that's a win, right? That's something to get excited about, and they know that they're having an impact, and now we're recuperating income for this property that can be used in other places. So we're not telling residents to take shorter showers, right, or restricting them. Now I will say though, we do have times when and Dominium has seen this, Kittle has seen this, a lot of our partners have, where hey, unit 305 for the last couple of weeks is just using a tremendous amount of water, but it's not leaking, right? And when I talk about actionable data, granular data, you can literally see that this unit is running water every hour of the night from 9 p.m. until 7 o'clock in the morning, right? 5 days a week, right? Let's say as an example. Hey, that site team now can go in and have a conversation with that resident and say, hey, what's going on, because your unit's using 10 times as much water as every other unit in the property. And it's, well, when I sleep, it really helps if I turn the water on and just run it all night, the noise. That sounds kind of crazy, but that's happened not often, but multiple times, right? And it's like, well, why don't we get you a white noise machine?
And like that is petty cash perfect by in terms of savings. Do that all day long. So like, oh, good dear. I was thinking like they were like had a crying baby, and there was like something with the baby. Like I don't have this. I was like, I didn't think they was like, oh, they were using running water for a white noise machine. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's my daughter right there.
Yeah. And I think it's just enabling that conversation, right? Like, hey, this use, how you're using water is detrimental to, our community that we've got here, and Penrose had a property, I think, after they came on board, and the site team was like, that unit's not leaking. We were like, we confirmed with them. We're like, it's definitely not leaking. Something's going on there. And, the kids were just, it was during the summer and they were just playing in the tub all day long, and, just had a lot of consumption, but at least they were able to have that conversation with the resident, right? To say, hey, can you not do that because that's detrimental, to the.
And here's some pool passes.
Yeah. Or so things of that nature. It's actionable data so that the site teams can be really efficient with the time and effort that they allocate, and that's just as big of a deal to us, right, as enabling the best water performance in the industry, right? We also want to reduce the amount of time and effort that's associated with getting there, right? At the site level, at the asset management level, at the executive level, right? Providing clear, actionable data and performance reporting, so that these opportunities for improvement can be capitalized on. And Dominium's at 37 gallons per bedroom per day, right? Tremendous performance, right? But they've gotten better every year over the last 3 years, right? Like, because they're able to capitalize on those opportunities, right? So the longer properties and portfolios are on our platform, the better they perform, right? So they're getting older, but their performance is actually better.
So Orlando, let me ask you this. So this is really a dashboard in your face, real time. Like this is how your property's performing from the water usage standpoint. That's kind of there. And there's other physical installation components. If I have a property that's currently existing and I've got the sub metering in place and so on and so forth, that's really not driven by you guys, but that would be an instrument that would be something that you guys would watch over.
Yeah, so when we implemented this at a development, and Kittle is a good example of this. We actually replaced about 4,000 sub meters that were being provided by another company, right? And they were billing residents with them. So they installed our sensors, replaced those. Our data can still be used, right, with billing partners. So we have work order integrations, right, with Yardi and RealPage as an example. But Yardi, RealPage can service our developers that are using our platform and are billing residents, in certain scenarios. They're using our data, right? So we're providing APIs of our data for those billing partners. But the difference is most sub meters today, and that's what we call our sensors, right? Because we don't want them to get confused. We're not just counting gallons, right? We're not establishing as a leak threshold, right? Oh, this unit used over 1,500 gallons of water, per day for 5 days in a row. So there's a high use alert, right? A high use alert, again, it's actionable data, right? We can't waste that site team's time, right? If we do, we lose them, right? They don't want to. We don't want to waste their time and have them try to figure out what's happening in these units, right? Or what they could potentially look into, because water's frustrating, right? Because you go into a unit, we tell a technician, unit 305 has I keep saying unit 305. I don't know what it is about those numbers, but that pesky unit 305. But unit 305 has a leaking toilet, right? And the technician will go into that unit, standing, over that toilet, and it's not leaking, right? And they're frustrated, right? Because Ion just told me to go into this unit because this toilet was leaking, and I can see that it's not leaking right now. But what they can see is that leak just stopped 2 hours ago, right? It had been leaking for 18 hours prior, right? And it had been repeating on and off for the last week. So they know that there's something still wrong with that toilet and they need to fix it. Okay, so it gives them the reassurance to know that it's not leaking right now, but it was leaking, and I need to make this fix. And sometimes leaks are difficult or tricky to find, right? And in those scenarios, right, we actually have live support, right, where a technician can be in a unit and we can actually have them isolate, the leak and troubleshoot it real time. We don't have to do that very often, but we can when it's needed. So all of these things it's gaining buy-in and trust, right, from you know everyone in these organizations, right, from the site level all the way to the executive level, that we're a committed partner to really see them realize these performance improvements.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left. If there's any questions or thoughts, and we have any, I think we're pretty good there. Oh, go ahead.
I think I think where you're going with is the size of the meter, the amount of water that the property would need, and we have provided some data. I don't know. I haven't. I know our operations team has, like with Scott Ewing as an example, Dominium's chief construction officer. That has come up at times where we'll be able to provide data, provide comp data to say a property of this size, this tenancy, right, should only be using this much water a day. We're not heavily involved in that. I know our operations team is from time to time. It doesn't come up too often, but also, our data is used to audit utilities as well sometimes. So that's not something that we do. We don't audit utility providers, but utility providers, I've been in the broader utility industry for a long time, and they make a lot of mistakes, right? So sometimes they're billing you based off of historical data, right? Sometimes there is faulty, metering, equipment and things of that nature. But we do have a number of partners that have worked with, we've seen bill data and things that didn't make sense, and we've alerted them to that, and there are parties out there that can actually go back and look at historical utility data and expense data, to get offsets. So like one example is sometimes utilities will do true ups for water, right? So they'll bill you for a long period of time based on historical use, and then they'll have somebody come out and do a meter reading, right? And they're like, oh, you owe us $150,000, for all of this additional water that you used, right? So you can push back on that, by saying, no, we don't. We didn't have that information. If we had it, we would have been able to make adjustments, right, to offset our bills, but or to address that, right? But in the real world now, without our system, you wouldn't know what actions to take necessarily to address that, to figure out what's causing that waste. And that's when you end up consuming your sites, your site teams end up consuming a lot of time trying to figure out what the problem is. And sometimes it doesn't get corrected for a very long time.
Yeah, I like the idea of being able to have a resource, because I mean, obviously, as we're going in and applying for funding and sizing our projects for financing, a lot of times we're taking a thumb in the wind on what we think those water usage numbers would look like. I mean, all the way down to like how many gallons are actually going through. So having a resource like that is great. What's a good time to get you guys involved, particularly in new construction? I think acquisition and the rehab component, you obviously are doing the systems and running the dashboard, but there sounds like somewhere in here there's some value add to getting you guys into the design side and looking at the design side on the new construction. So early on, you can be set up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of our partners, once they begin working with us, there's maybe an initial pilot, phase or period, but then we become the basis of design, right? So we meet with their construction teams, sometimes their architectural teams. It's a very simple, uplift to plans and things of that nature, so that we're specified in those deals. Very straightforward, but you know, we there really isn't, the earlier the better, I guess, but even projects that are don't have a specified in, we're being injected, later, or to help with that sizing or something of that nature. It might be a first project. There's typically no issues with us incorporating, our system into those plans.
Yeah, gotcha. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, no. So these are good. I know we probably have had a resident tamper with one of our sensors. I don't. It's if it. I'm sure it's happened, right? But it's extremely rare. That's typically like if a device falls offline and if we lose connection, right? So essentially, think of all these sensors. They're in every single unit, and then they're centralized gateways. And each of these sensors is communicating back to this centralized gateway. So when one of those falls off, it creates a flag. What happened? We lost data. We reach out to the site team. The first thing we check is did the resident, is it still there? Is it still there, or did does it look like it's been damaged or something of that nature? So that very rarely happens, but not to say that it couldn't. And typically they're installed like in the utility closets, or an area where a resident wouldn't even think to tamper with it. And then on the performance side, a lot of times what we really suggest is when piloting with us at operating properties, that you don't do just one, right? So do a pilot with us. We understand that you want to kick the tires and make sure that the system's working well, and that, Orlando's not full of it, and or the rest of our team, that this is real. But it's great to do it at multiple properties, right? So 3, 4, 5 properties at once, because it does really layer in like peer performance, right, metrics. And our system will go live, right? The site teams have like some pretty, we try and make it simple, like you want to maintain less than 10% leak volume. You don't want any catastrophic leaks to go beyond 2 days. You don't want any leaks to go beyond 7 days. That's as simple as possible. You can't fix leaks every day, right? And if you really can't fix leaks, raise your hand, right? And say you need help because you can see that the property is losing a lot of water, right? Let's get a local plumbing group in or someone to help. But a lot of times we'll see some site teams will take it wholeheartedly and run with it, right? And say, hey, this is amazing, right? And they get really excited about it. And then sometimes you have, maybe some personnel, differences or whatever, and they're like, I don't want to go do this today, But what you'll see is there's leaks. Like, we're tracking how many days they've been repeated, right? And how much aggregate water was associated with these units that weren't addressed. And some of our developers, they use our data to give kudos, right? Asset management teams are evaluating the performance and they're like, hey guys, you did great. Sometimes this is communicated out to the entire company, right? Saying these are the properties that have done a great job, had a great turnaround. But if you're on the opposite side of that, right? And it's, hopefully not because of neglect, right? Sometimes it's, you had a site team that left, or you had some turnover, or we've got to make sure that the new people know that the system's in place. But when there's neglect, right, like that's when you don't have the opportunity, like, because our system will literally tell you, yeah, for the last 30 days or for a month, this property was at 70% leak volume, right? These are all of, and as of yesterday, these are the units that are still leaking and what needs to be addressed, right? So it's very actionable and correctable, right? But it does take that action, like that wrench has to be turned.
That's why AI can't solve everything. Right? Someone's got to turn the wrench at the end of the
Yes.
day. Yeah. Well, we're at 3:00. Any other questions while we still have the panel here? Looks like we're pretty good shape. So thank you guys for doing this. Orlando,
Quinn.
amazing. Celia, always good to see you. Lily, coming in. Yeah. So thank you.